Thank you everyone for coming to our presentation. My name is Aaron Peckham. This is my friend Evan Haggard. And today we will be presenting Comic Books Are Literature. Now, our primary inspiration for this project comes from the false comment idea that we've been hearing that some people don't consider comic books real literature. And so with this presentation, we'll be giving kind of an overview of the genre as a whole, looking at the medium itself and what makes it unique from other genres of literature, as well as a brief history of the genre and some of the universal themes that we find within comic books. And so the first thing we want to discuss is the comic book medium. Of course, one of the main elements of this is its use of nonverbal or non-written communication of a narrative. This is everything as simple as facial expressions, which the reader can really see and more fully relate to than if they were to simply read it on a page. This could also go as far as more abstract and complicated and complex images and ideas that are really limited only to the artist's imagination, and that would be much harder to understand or truly visualize if really just written down. And comic books also take advantage of this visual layout through a paneled layout. Each panel, of course, represents a moment in time. As you can see on this page from the Batman comic, how each different panel shows a different moment that moves along the fight. And we can kind of follow that a few pages at a time as we read through a narrative of Batman saying what Gotham means to him while being able to visualize something unrelated and how the two flow together in a very fluid, yet seemingly unrelated, but still connected narrative. There are also three different kinds of imagery that are employed in this.
The sensory diegetic imagery, actually, if you were to refer to the Superman comic to the right of the Batman comic, then you will see that there are two action words, boom and crack. And those are good examples of sensory diegetic imagery. And then the non-sensory imagery is text boxes and speech bubbles and also just thought bubbles. So,
as well as hermeneutic imagery, which is primarily, it's very rare, it's the most rare of these three, but hermeneutic imagery is when the story moves along strictly through images with no text at all. Valiant Comics makes use of this in several scenes where you see several different panels of a person moving silently through a city or a street or a building, and the story is told without any text at all. And now we will move on to a brief history of comic books, and this is separated into three main eras: the early industrial age, the late industrial age, and the more modern age, which is known as the heroic age.
all right. So now, in the 1890s, we actually see the very first comic strips that come out, and so what happened was that one of the best known examples of the Golden Age would be the Golden Boy, which we don't have up here, but now the Golden Age, there was actually a superhero boom, which meant that like this was after Superman, after the first Superman comic, Action Comics #1, and so Silver Age was more realistic stories and also more realistic people. For instance, we would see that Superman would turn out to be vulnerable to kryptonite, and also Peter Parker, several other people would be more realistic in those stories. And however, okay, so now the Bronze Age, which is now a lot of people in the community had thought that comic books were just ways to promote child delinquency, and they also said, hey, maybe it actually makes eyesight terrible too. So what they did was that it turned into government hearings, book burnings, and several other actions that they do. And now we're going to go to the late industrial age. Now, the late industrial age. This was a time when the whole entire comic book company was, all these companies were struggling to survive in this rural world. Now, Dell Comics, who actually fell in 1970. It turns out that they were trying so much because their titles were falling. And Marvel Comics, however, they weren't doing so good either. So what they do was that they decided to jump on the bandwagon and basically say, "Hey, superheroes are actually good for a profit. How about we try and make more?" So anyway, what we do is that we have even more realistic stories, and as I said before, it was also more superheroes that were less than perfect, like Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four. And then here we have the heroic age. Now this is the continuous rise of DC and Marvel. These rise of publishers, the Mirage and Image Comics. Mirage, best known work for their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics. Image Comics being just different stuff. And then the increase in diversity, which is Milestone Comics, who they, as Aaron would say,
Milestone Comics was one of the independent publishers that came about during this age that was primarily a black-led company, led primarily by black creators and featured in usually black characters such as Static Shock and Icon, which were later bought up by DC Comics, but Milestone Comics is where characters like that. And so now we'll move on to kind of some of the themes within comic books. Now, comic books, while seeming primarily like entertainment, also contain a great deal of deeper philosophical thought. Tom and Matt Morris, authors of Superheroes and Philosophy, put it, the best superhero comics, in addition to being tremendously entertaining, introduce and treat in vivid ways some of the most interesting and important questions facing all of human beings. Stan Lee similarly states that in writing the typical Marvel type of tale, it's almost impossible not to become involved in some extraneous philosophical or moralistic side issue. And what they're getting at here is that while comic books are made primarily to entertain, they, as well as the entire rest of the universe of literature, contain greater themes that cannot be avoided when writing a good story in order to make it realistic, in order to make it readable, in order to make it matter, really. And many of these themes cover just some of the most basic questions of humanity. Questions like good versus evil. Of course, in comic books and superhero comics, we get the obvious dichotomy of good guys versus bad guys, which we see all the time, nonstop. And it seems very stereotypical of comic books. However, Stan Lee makes the case that good versus evil is a universal theme that you will find in any good story, whether that be a mystery novel, a horror novel, a crime novel, or even a simple drama. Good versus evil is really one of the most universal themes that you will find in every branch of literature. There are also more specific themes such as justice, which we of course see in obvious examples like Superman and Batman being members of the Justice League, fighting for what's good and right, protecting good people from harm. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows there, as comic books also delve into some of the darker aspects of that question and what it really means to be just and why are superheroes good. Of course, Superman himself is a very perfect example that we may tie to Plato's Ring of Gyges that Socrates describes in the Republic. In the Ring of Gyges analogy, Socrates presents this idea of a ring that will turn the wearer invisible. And so with this analogy, he asks the question, of course, what does the unjust person do with no consequence for whatever they want to do that's unjust. And what does the just person do who has no consequence for being unjust and will not be seen or rewarded for doing what is just? And many have argued that the just person would be corrupted by this. And we do, of course, see a specific example of this in the video game Injustice: Gods Among Us, in a storyline where Superman, this super powerful, super perfect being, actually does become evil and starts acting unjustly. We also have more specific themes such as responsibility, which Spider-Man is, of course, well known as an example of his very first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15, ending with the phrase, saying, "With great power there must also come great responsibility." And that has been a common theme, especially throughout Spider-Man stories, how with this great power you need to be responsible with it, which provides more positive lessons for readers as opposed to promoting childhood delinquency, as some would argue. And there are also very political themes in these stories as well. There are some fairly obvious ones, such as patriotism and nationalism are some of the bigger questions. Captain America himself is, I mean, look at him. You can't say that Captain America is not a political statement. As you see, there have been several stories featuring such characters as Captain America, Superman, who in some cases have even set aside their allegiance to America to ask, what really is the American way? Or can I truly represent this nation? Or what does it mean for a nation to be good? And of course, you get some more analogies like through the X-Men, which are very representative of the civil rights era as they first appeared in, where you have mutants that are very different from humans with their superpowers and in many cases very different appearances, such as Nightcrawler, who doesn't even look human, looks more like a demon as we would understand it. And of course, in the stories, they would be fighting for their rights and fighting to be understood and accepted as citizens amongst an oppressive time, which was very representative of the civil rights era when Black people and even Mexican American people were having to fight for their own rights and equality. And of course, you get such themes as representation, as you get in the 60s, the appearance of the first mainstream Black superhero, Black Panther, which Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created because they realized all of our characters are white. We're not really representing our entire diversity of fans. And of course, that was a theme that would continue with further Black superheroes such as Luke Cage, Static Shock, Black Lightning, all the way to other groups such as more Latino characters, more Asian characters, even in the early 2000s when the X-Men Iceman came out and became the first openly gay superhero in a comic book. And so these, in addition, so just between philosophical and political themes, these are all universal themes that we can find throughout other genres of literature as well. And so here are works cited. We hope that this kind of very broad overview kind of helps you to get an idea of just how comic books fit all the same criteria as every other area of literature. So, do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
Just a simple question of fact. Why do you call that heroic era heroic?
That is simply the that I'm not actually sure entirely why. That is simply the term that pop culture uses to refer to that era. As it was during that era that we of course saw Marvel and DC more rapidly rise to what we now know today. Those are the big two. And of course the superhero boom had already happened decades before, but by then, of course, that was what comic books were primarily known for. Those are my best guesses.
Okay.
I can't quite think specifically why they chose the more modern era specifically as a heroic era, but that's my idea.
Was there can you kind of pinpoint when that era took off?
Probably the 90s maybe, because in the 1980s they had it was continuing the rise, but now they're at their peak in the 90s since.
Yeah, and they've really just kind of continued going up from there.
I was gonna say, and that drives kind of with where I was going with it. One of the arguments I heard is with the release of the 1989 Michael Keaton Batman movie that sparked a lot of interest for a lot of people, and that kind of steamrolled all the way through the 90s and got us eventually to where we are with the MCU. And all sorts of
That as well. That is really when it, of course, when superhero movies started being made very well, with earlier only having a few examples like Christopher Reeve's Superman was a very rare occurrence of the superhero genre making it to film. We're starting in the 80s, Marvel and DC both started making more films, many of which were not great quality, but of course many would be remade in the 90s and then early 2000s, and then of course today with the cultural phenomenon that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yes, sir.
As you describe the themes, they sound like the themes of literature. Would you guys want to argue, or have you encountered someone who would argue that the particular medium nudges this genre towards certain themes and away from others? Or is uniquely suited to certain themes? Or is it just another way in which literature is expressed?
I would say it's really just another way in which literature is expressed. Though we have encountered a few people who make the argument that comic books are not real literature, they don't really give very detailed reasons as to why they say that. I do feel like especially the superhero genre, it is somewhat uniquely suited for such themes as like justice and responsibility with power, which is why those are the two main ones that came to mind when I was researching. Of course, there are many more. Of course, you get personal relationships as well as more just personal stuff, like in several Spider-Man comics, you'll have discussion of honesty and why white lies are good or bad.
That's the one section.
Yes, sir.
Do you know why back in the 1890s literature started to become composed in comic book form or comic strip form?
Well, let me see here. I think I have no idea, but I'll look into that because I don't know for sure because they seemed like it would just evolve from there because like I don't know, demanding from readers, I guess, I don't know.
It really is a creative expression of creativity. Of course, you saw on the past slide where it referred to political cartoons and comic strips, which you would often find in the news. They were not always very well drawn, but it was a simple, fun way. We're not really sure why it started there.
I can address a little bit of that. I mean, and this is by no means a definitive answer at all, but I mean, with in the mid-1800s, sort of the rise of the serialized story, the episodic, Dickens, published this stuff a bit at a time. Got paid by the word, so that's not it's not very wordy. But you also have, the dime novels of Western eras and things like that, where you see kind of these cheap novels fulfilling a fundamental need for cheap entertainment. People didn't want to read Dickens, that as badly as they wanted to be entertainment. And so it was not by any means as good as what we consider literature being now. But at the same time, it was still, I don't know, it's the difference between pop fiction and literary fiction now, right? I mean, it does still have a niche that it occupies. And I would argue too, the earlier comics, were very much more cut and dry. They were adventure stories rather than character stories, things like that. until the comics themselves become more complex, that they kind of take on a lot of that thematic relevance that we see now. I would argue that comic books weren't always literature, but they are certainly now.
Yeah, that you mentioned serial comics and serial novels, which is another interesting point that we actually recently started thinking about in regards to like the possibility of the question rising. Why are comics sold in individual issues? That is another aspect that comic books took from different genres of literature at the time they first started rising up. As of course you gave the example of Charles Dickens and several other authors that could save money on printing by selling their novels one chapter at a time, which is a format that I guess just stuck better with comics, I guess.
And also, I think it's probably just for cliffhangers sometimes.
That also does work.
And it lends itself to story arcs and things too.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How big of an impact would you say that the works of Alan Moore and Frank Miller had on the industry?
Oh boy, I would say they had an amazing impact. Especially with Frank Miller, you get much darker stories, such as The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Returns, as well as his work with Daredevil, which made Daredevil a much darker character. I'd say Alan Moore and Frank Miller, while not my personal favorite authors, I respect them highly because they had such impact on the genre as a whole. While comic books at the time they came around were already pretty complex, they were still very much lighthearted, and of course you have to deal with the comics code and making comics more acceptable to young children as parents were concerned. What authors like Alan Moore and Frank Miller did, they really spent more time bringing in some of these darker, heavier, more adult themes into comic books, that they were able to take comic books and dive even deeper into philosophical questions of
Social
humanity.
situations.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
In word-based literature, we sometimes get what, and I'm in the presence of a real poet, so sometimes it seems as if the creator, for the sheer joy of playfulness with language, does things, and we call it poetry sometimes. What's the equivalent of poetry in comic books? Is there one?
Oh, I would definitely say that would be Stan Lee coined the term the Marvel method, which you discovered actually.
Let me see.
That was where primarily artists would draw the stories that they wrote themselves, and then the people described as writers would focus more on specific dialogue and things. That's really where, kind of when I was going through visual images, how things that are only limited to the artist's imagination. Many stories written by the likes of Jack Kirby, who was an artist, what he did was he would draw his story, he would write it that way, and then discuss it with Stan Lee, who would help him fill in smaller details like dialogue and things like that. Any other questions?